Good evening, and welcome to the 9th chapter of the One Book, One Minnesota statewide book club, featuring We Are Meant to Rise, Voices for Justice from Minneapolis to the World, edited by Carolyn Holbrook and David Mura. The One Book, One Minnesota program is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book in partnership with the State Library Service and sponsored by Spire Credit Union. I'm Elaine Hopkins, Director of Programs and Services for the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress designated Minnesota Center for the Book. As such, we present programming that reaches all corners of our state and promotes reading, libraries, and our state's literary legacy. The Minnesota Center for the Book is housed on Dakota land. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. I also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. Please take a look at the link in the chat to learn more about the Dakota people's relationship to Minnesota through the Bedote Memory Map, Indigenous Justice Fact Sheets, and the Land Back Movement. Tonight's program has live captioning provided by Lisa Richardson, and we're thrilled to welcome attendees from all over the state. Thank you all for choosing to spend your time with us this evening. Now, I am honored to introduce our featured guests. Carolyn Holbrook is founder and director of More Than a Single Story, as well as the founder of Sassy, The Right Place. She is the author of the Minnesota Book Award-winning collection, Tell Me Your Names and I Will Testify, and co-author of Dr. Josie Johnson's memoir, Hope in the Struggle. Her essays have been published widely, and she was the first person of color to win the Kay Sexton Award for contributions to Minnesota's literary community. Douglas Kearney has published 7 poetry collections, including Show, winner of the Minnesota Book Award, and Buck Studies, winner of the Theodore Rothke Memorial Poetry Award and the Firecracker Award for Poetry from the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses, and a California Book Award silver medalist in poetry. He has written a collection of libretti and operas. He received a Whiting Writers Award, a Foundation for Contemporary Arts Cy Twombly Award for Poetry, and residencies and fellowships from Cave Canem and the Rauschenberg Foundation. Ed Bok Lee attended kindergarten in Seoul, South Korea, and grew up in North Dakota and Minnesota. He was later educated in South Korea, Kazakhstan, and on the west and east coasts of the United States. He's written 3 books of poetry, Real Karaoke People, World, and Mitochondrial Night. Honors for his books include an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation, a Penn Open Book Award, a Minnesota Book Award, and an Asian American Literary Award, Member's Choice. Ricardo Levins Morales is a Puerto Rican artist and trickster organizer based in Minneapolis. His organizing life began in the Chicago Black Panther Defense Committee and has included the Alliance for Cultural Democracy, the Northland Poster Collective, Labor Notes, the Great Lakes Commons, and most recently, MPD 150. He supports activists and organizers in the work of healing and liberation. David Mura has written 10 books, including the memoirs Turning Japanese, a New York Times notable book, Where the Body Meets Memory, 4 poetry collections, and A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing. He teaches at VONA, a writers' conference for writers of color, and has worked with Alex Pate's Innocent Classroom, a program designed to improve relationships between teachers and students of color. Melissa Olson is an Indigenous person of mixed Anishinaabe and Euro-American heritage, a tribal citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. For several years, Melissa has worked as a writer and producer of independent public media, serving as the co-managing editor of the Miniculture program at KFAI Fresh Air Community Radio in Minneapolis. Welcome to you all. Now, I am so pleased to hand things over to Carolyn and David to start us off.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you so much for inviting us in our book to be the 9th chapter of this year's One Book, One Minnesota. And many thanks to everyone who is here tonight online. I want to thank the University of Minnesota Press and my co-editor, David Mura. And a big thanks to the 33 writers who lent their voices to this anthology. As you know, some of them are here with us tonight. I couldn't be prouder that the organization I founded, More Than a Single Story, now stands among the many who have raised a voice to speak out about this fraught moment in American and Minnesota history. My co-editor, David Mura, wrote a beautiful introduction to our anthology. His introduction is followed by my introduction to More Than a Single Story. And I would like to share just a little bit of my introduction with you. And then I'll turn it over to David. This book grows out of the first 5 years of More Than a Single Story, a series of panel discussions and public conversations in the Twin Cities that I created to offer a platform for Black, Indigenous, and people of color writers and arts activists to discuss issues of importance to us in our own words and in our own voices. More Than a Single Story was inspired when I invited several members of my writing group, Twin Cities Black Women Writing, to join me in a reading at a local bookstore. During the Q&A, a white audience member expressed surprise that we didn't all sound alike and that we wrote about a great variety of topics rather than 1 or 2 topics that are expected of us. My first thought was, damn, did she really say that? But I had to admit that unfortunately, this is a view that is too often held by members of the dominant culture. The woman's comment made me resolve to find a way to add my voice to the voices of others who are working to change that perception. And moving forward, I designed a series of 3 panel discussions that featured women of African descent who live in Minnesota. And the Loft Literary Center graciously hosted us. The first panel featured African-American women, the second, women with Caribbean backgrounds, and the third was East and West African women. I named the series More Than a Single Story, a title based loosely on Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's well-known TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, which warns against fostering stereotypes by treating one story of a people as their only story. I had no idea how the series would be received. I was pleasantly surprised when audiences filled the auditorium for all 3 panels. The success of the first year showed me that there is a need for such discussions. I expanded the program, focusing on specific topics and inviting writers from across the BIPOC communities to participate in our panels, creating opportunities for us to talk openly and cross-culturally about issues that impact our lives, but are not typically discussed in depth or authentically in public settings. Then moving along here, when I first decided to put this anthology together, I knew I wanted to work with David Mura. In our own different ways, we have both done much through the years to serve our community. Some refer to us as godparents of the Twin Cities BIPOC literary community. Our initial plan was to invite writers to focus on the topics that we have presented in our public panels. The pandemic, followed by the murder of George Floyd, expanded our vision. No longer could we stay focused only on the topics presented in the first 5 years of the program. As David pointed out in his introduction, in their own ways, all of the writers in this volume are witnesses to history, whether it is the events of 2020 or the histories of their communities within Minnesota and the broader American history, with themes of family, cultural heritage, and the racial landscapes of our country woven throughout. There is more than a single story in Minnesota, and it is the multitude of our stories that is our greatest strength. So I will turn it over to David now.
Hello. I'm going to read just in the first paragraph of my introduction. For readers, this anthology of Minnesota writers of color and Indigenous writers will serve as many things. A presentation of the growing diversity of Minnesota and of the many voices that are great within us. A series of lenses on the American experience. A bouquet of wordsmiths and thinkers, memoirists and novelists, poets and activists. A panoply of witnesses to the year 2020 one of the strangest and most unsettling in our history. Inspired by the more than single story series of public panels and discussions, this anthology is an exploration of what so many people of color and Indigenous communities have experienced in their lives. It's also an encouragement for each of us, no matter our race and ethnicity, to speak out, to tell our own stories, to own our own power. What I love about this anthology is that it is demonstrative of the incredible diversity of this state. And the writers come from many different communities. And the anthology is also a testament to the creative power of the different communities that are here in this state. And I've watched many of these writers grow up. Carolyn and I have been together for many years in this community. And this is one of the strongest literary communities in the country, and certainly one of the most activists. Now, this anthology has become not only a testament to present day Minnesota, but it is also a series of voices to the future, telling what happened in 2020, telling testaments about how various of these writers and their communities and families have been affected by our history. In my case, I'm a third generation Japanese American. My parents were imprisoned during World War II at ages 11 and 15 in internment camps behind barbed wire and rifle towers with guards. And yet no Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage. And it was found out 40 years later that the FBI had found that the Japanese Americans were not a military threat, but lied to the public. And the Solicitor General lied in the Supreme Court about this fact. And it was only 40 years later that the American government, the Congress and President Ronald Reagan apologized to the Japanese American community and admitted that there was no military necessity for the camps, but instead the real reasons were racism, wartime hysteria, and a failure of leadership. Now, when Donald Trump was asked about the internment camps, he said, I don't know, you'd had to have been there, which means he was not aware that President Reagan recognized that the camps were an act of racism and not of military necessity. In other words, he was ignorant of our history. And one of the things about this anthology is it says that our history, our story of America, needs to be told by many different voices. I have an upcoming book, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths in Our American Narratives. And I say, from its very beginning, America had two irreconcilable goals. One was to seek equality, freedom, and democracy. The other was to maintain white supremacy and the domination by white people over any people of color. White America is fine with telling our tale through the lens of the first goal, but it is still not yet decidedly fine with the telling of the second story of America's treatment of people of color and America's desire to maintain white supremacy. All the recent ridiculous, distorting, disparaging, and damning of critical race theory are just the latest manifestations of this repression. We now have people trying to ban the story of Ruby Bridges, the 6-year-old girl who desegregated a New Orleans school in the early 60s. What people don't recognize and what this anthology says, first of all, is that diversity is our strength. In my essay, I write about how Japanese American soldiers were trained in the military intelligence service at Fort Snelling and Camp Savage. And because of their work in the Pacific, working as interrogators, as translators of captured documents and messages, as guides on the battlefield, MacArthur's chief of intelligence said that these Japanese American soldiers shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved probably 2 million American lives, 1 million American lives. What this proves is that even though the Japanese Americans were, many of their families were in prison, they believed in the idea of America. They believed in the goal of equality, freedom, and democracy. So diversity is our strength. That has to happen in terms of literature. It has to happen in terms of the telling of our history. And when people say, you can't tell our children these stories, you can't tell our children stories about race in America, I think we're really selling our children short. We're also ignoring that many parents of color have to tell their children stories of police brutality, of police killings. And as Douglas Kearney says in his very eloquent essay, this is part of what every African American needs to tangle with and deal with in talking to their children. So this concern for the sensibilities of our children ought to be to teach them the truth of our history, to teach them how we became to the present so that we can better imagine the future. I'll cede the stage now to Douglas and Douglas Kearney and his essay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you also, Carolyn, and One Book, One Minnesota. Thank you all for being here. Dear editor, here's the opening note. Scant days after Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, I received an email from an editor of an online magazine. The email was a request to respond to the murder, calling on roughly my expertise in anti-Blackness, my stature, and my proximity on the ground, an unfortunate choice of words, in the Twin Cities. Instead of producing an exclusive comment, I posted a version of this statement on my Facebook account on June 5th, 2020. It was late in the morning, almost noon. I have made very few revisions. Dear editor, I thank you for this invitation. Funny, I composed a poem about the historic Watts uprisings on Sunday, May 24th, before the MPD murdered George Floyd. There's a part of me that wants to simply send you all of what I've already written, not as some authority, but to point out simply that this is a changing same, that I and many others are always thinking about the conditions under which George Floyd and so many others are subject. The combination of these as features, not bugs, in systemic modes of violence that are part of the purview of policing. As my wife and I explained to our 10-year-olds who learned explicitly about a then contemporaneous application of this constant historic killing when St. Anthony police officer Geronimo Yanez murdered Philando Castile. It isn't that law enforcement is simply disinterested in protecting Black people, but that US culture, law dictate that our very presence is the thing they are meant to protect against. That white comfort has come to define itself as dependent on methodical control of everyone they deem other is true. Settler colonialism, slavery, racism, forced displacement within the country, deportation, xenophobia, lynching, segregation, official exclusionary acts, internment, redlining, underemployment, food deserts, compromised healthcare access, the prison industry, genocidal wet works, and on and on and on and on. In this, Black people have the horrifying underprivilege of being mass mediatization's most consistent public face of a comfort control equation involving law enforcement and murder. And as such, we, along with everyone else, see Black people murdered and assaulted by police and para-police vigilantes again and again across this country's news cycle with a sure-shot efficiency. That white supremacy put me in the position to make this a reasonable conversation to have with my then 6-year-olds. It's the violence I will never forgive. I will go to work carrying it. I will share social space carrying it. I will form friendships carrying it. Yet I will not forgive it. But back to the invitation. I've grappled with your request because you see, I wonder, at what point does another piece triggered in response to the changing same become a part of the control comfort ecosystem? this is complex, and that writing such things is not cathartic for me, and I'd imagine many others. Many different kinds of people could read what I've written, including people who are on the short end of the control comfort stick. I wonder this honestly. When is writing about violence against Black people not a prediction, by which I mean this violence is always happening? So when I wrote the poem I mentioned above, was I reacting to Watts refracted through the historical pattern of the changing same? Was I acting in anticipation or response to the same thing happening again? Or was I, like the pastoral poet, not set on waiting for the event of fall in order to write about the redness in the arbor, but simply looking out my window in some October and watching a cycle continue? Understand, I am angry, editor, not with the invitation. Precisely, I am angry that a policeman murdered George Floyd. I'm angry that members of my community must risk their safety from more violence and a pandemic to demonstrate against the changing same. But for this letter, dear editor, I'm angry that despite all I've written alongside contemporaries who have written even better, adding to a tradition we carry on because it is the cycle in which our ancestors fell, suddenly read to the ground, and those who could wrote about it also better than I, that what seems to be the case is that maybe if we try again, maybe if we write it more clearly and passionately, but not too passionately, or perhaps more passionately, or with more nuance, perhaps with unequivocal statements, or more musically, maybe with greater eloquence, no, plain speech, that maybe if we do it just right and do it new and do it now with speed and urgency for those moments they are paying attention, white people will finally realize that they are responsible for changing themselves. And via their massive, more sacrosanct voting power, disproportionately large economic resources, gross overrepresentation in positions of power, and most importantly, prime access to their own psyches for speedily and urgently, dismantling the systems that exist for them and their privilege. And yes, class is critical to this, but more fluid than perceived race. Police don't check your credit rating before they shoot, club, rough ride, or strangle your life away because you see, they already know what they think you're worth. So I don't know what to write about this other than a police officer named Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, and Chauvin apparently had never done anything so unbecoming of an officer as to be permanently relieved of duty prior, who, because several other police officers were present as he murdered George Floyd over the course of about 9 minutes, apparently didn't seem to be doing anything unbecoming of an officer on Monday, May 25th either. I will write that Black people are being asked to be patient again and show faith that maybe this time will be the one that really makes a difference, even as the same old narratives about property damage roll out from the owners of stolen land. I will write that again, my children are terrified because this is terrorism. I will write that the president's vile white supremacism doesn't let the brakes off of white supremacy at large, for to suggest so would require the ridiculous fancy that the train was built with any thought that it should ever have to stop.
I think next is Ed Bok Lee on the list. Ed?
Yeah, I was just looking for my applause emoji. Thank you, Doug. I think I got hit with spit in the face from that reading. That's a compliment. Thank you all for putting this anthology together and being here and putting this event together. My essay is called Pandemic Love. It's 23 parts, so I'm going to jump around. All right, here we go. Need these. Pandemic Love. 2. Lately, I also eavesdrop on the encoding far below my dreams. So far, I've learned I don't want to die any more than all songs and laughter want to end. Yet I don't want to live forever. I'm saying I want to keep traveling this archipelago of life and death, leaping freely from one small moment to the next. I want to sleep peacefully inside each of my flaws without first having to get sick. Whatever makes us smile, hug, kiss, share food with beloved strangers, invent songs, and sometimes even belly aching jokes of death is also contagious. In fact, everything but the physical body dies without this. 3. I saw proof of all this in the white cop's calm and peace, 4 centuries of ghostly granite statues holding down his throbbing American knee. I heard it in every parent's contemplation of late night sirens afterward for weeks throughout our city. In the hospitals, rupturing excess bodies out windows, I smelled a nation of cinder blocks, motor oil, and acrylic smoldering in each direction from and including the charred 3rd Precinct Police Station here in South Minneapolis. After standing with my daughter at 38th in Chicago, the corner of George Floyd's murder, 6 blocks away from where her life came into being, for a whole day, I couldn't eat. 4. At 4 years old, my daughter observes her raw, re-washed hands, asks thoughtlessly if rust can grow on songs. She doesn't know exactly where reality begins and ends. Her consciousness contains innumerable sprouts with tiny petals and bold tendrils. One day, I'll explain that our American president, when this pandemic began, had previously starred in his own reality show in which he played a boss who capriciously terminated people. Eventually, I'll also mention that other American president from a generation or two before, a B-movie actor, best known in Hollywood for his supporting role against alongside a chimpanzee named Bonzo, how that pandemic's virus called AIDS in the 80s was rumored to have originated from sex with monkeys in Africa as CIA-sanctioned crack first hit the streets. But for now, she's still too young to distinguish reality from fantasy. 6. Cicada killer wasps are thriving during the summer of sirens. My daughter and I watch as one stings its victim on a quivering tree branch. The predator then drags its winged prey, whirring and flailing down into its underground lair to lay eggs inside the victim's immobilized body. We rise from our knees. I listen to all the cicadas' screams throughout history. Up and down the boulevard, these terrestrial wasps' myriad little dirt mounds resemble landmines on otherwise immaculate lawns. We move on homeward, later passing the Pioneer and Soldiers Memorial Cemetery, where African-American soldiers, by some accounts hundreds, from the Civil War are buried, just a few blocks from the Little Earth housing projects for Native Americans in, uncoincidentally, the 3rd Precinct. She stops to re-Velcro her sneaker and wonders aloud where all the endless sirens are going. I don't say to leave, or that according to Plato, there were 3 kinds of sirens: celestial, generative, and purifying sirens, who, through beautiful and enchanting songs, would lure passing sailors to sleep, then murder them. 12. Between propriety and property, which is more indispensable? If corporations can have rights, what about living, colonizing pathogens? 16. After receiving the news, I send flowers, then click in search of my artist friend's funeral photos online. It feels like walking alone down a faint path through thick woods where all the twigs underfoot are not twigs, but bones. 17. A virus replicates because it can. Humans replicate because. 21. I saw a tree. It was speaking to 3 passers-by in masks, one holding a camera. When finally they left, I approached and stared at the tree for 20 million years. It came and went over and again. I did too. From particle to amoeba to cicada to python to angel to seahorse to demon to virus to bat to horse to human in a wild and vast bestiary of blurs, like bacteria inside and all around us, without which we would die. Maybe we come and go too fast for trees or even God to perceive us. Though sometimes, in fleeting glimpses, we appear in their dreams. 22. At high noon, the granola my daughter has made almost sizzles on its plate. We leave it with the other items on the table and move on. This summer, hundreds of tents have appeared like mushrooms and wildflowers in public parks all over the city. One such encampment of a few dozen or so houseless people, including families and children, has recently gone up not far from our community garden plot. You can hear them laughing, crying, talking, sometimes arguing, sometimes playing music or drumming. Where? Says my daughter. Here? Sure, I say. We are planting kale and spinach, soon to harvest the perilla. Meanwhile, sirens keep ruing in the distance. Back home, we blanch, marinate, and season the leaves, garlic, plantain, and other panchan my mother, a child war refugee, once taught me how to prepare. At the time, it seemed like art, a superfluous novelty. 23. I know a new kind of longing is breaking through even the oldest longings deep within you. It feels frightening. It feels free.
Thank you, Ed. The next reader is Ricardo Levins Morales, who's coming from us actually from Puerto Rico. Ricardo?
Yes, hello. In fact, I'm joining you from a little outbuilding on the farm that I was born onto in the western mountains of Puerto Rico, accompanied by 2 solar lanterns and a flashlight, which will explain strange lighting. And this is the island known in the indigenous historical language as Boriquen, in the language of the people erroneously remembered as the Taino. And it's lovely to be here with you. Thank you, Carolyn and David. And it was easy for me to forget that I wasn't just here to listen, but I guess I should join you in reading as well. My piece is called 4 Genies. We're all in this together. That was the call echoing in the public square, spoken by activists, healthcare workers, and politicians alike, as the initial shockwaves of the pandemic rippled through the social bedrock. But are we? Well, we're certainly all in this. Together might be a bit of an overstatement. Our lives are being impacted in ways as different as the chasms of race, class, gender, and colonial status, and all the other disease vectors of injustice can make them. Crisis under capitalism is the great amplifier, not the great equalizer. Since I wrote these words, in the early days of the pandemic, the shocks have continued. On my birthday this year, George Floyd was murdered. Center stage, lights up, igniting a firestorm of protest and rebellion that spread across the land, eerily reflected in the burning forests to the west. When my family brought me here from Puerto Rico as a boy, smoke filled the skies over Chicago in the long, hot summer of 1967. Soon I'd be protesting other police murders, Manuel Ramos, Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, embarking on what would be a life in what we like to call the struggle. But this time it's also different. Like a sapling and the tree that it grows into are all the same and also different. As the machines of capital devour habitats and grind them into financial instruments, the tiny inhabitants of those lands under names like Zika and Ebola and COVID move into the villages along the vectors of oppression and vulnerability. Sheltering in place, therefore, has different meanings. Quality time with parents, confinement with an abuser, adapting to remote teaching, binging TV shows, fear of deportation, rest and creativity, separation, grieving. And then those among us venturing to work with inadequate protections and with constant worries about what you might unintentionally bring home. The tectonic plates of our social world are shifting. The old normal is damaged beyond control. Amid the chaos, truths long hidden are escaping. Like the magic genies of Arab folklore, trapped for centuries inside of oil lamps, yearning to be free. The first of these truths is the centrality of working people. Suddenly, packagers and cooks and drivers and nurses and childcare workers, personal care attendants and fast food workers being praised as heroes. The people whose supposed insignificance has long justified low wages and shoddy treatment, and their demands for sick leave, health coverage, and closing of workplaces have unleashed a wave of organizing across the country. Next comes the genie of collective effort. Millions of people are participating in a massive effort in which no one person's actions can make the difference alone, but our combined actions can change the course of events, undermining the learned hopelessness that tells us that my voice, my protest, my choices don't matter. Justice and humanity are often overpowered, Frederick Douglass once observed, but they are persistent and eternal forces and fearful to contend against. The third genie tells us that the resources we've needed were there all along. Trillions of dollars that were never offered to house, clothe, feed, and heal us appear out of thin air when the survival of the aristocracy is threatened. The third genie asks, why is access to all our basic needs controlled by predators anyway? Why not by us? Last but not least of the genies comes the biggest and most significant and frightening of them all. The clear evidence that generosity, sharing, and solidarity are better organizing principles than greed. Even the mighty corporate elite that worships greed and preys on the vulnerable as a desperate effort has had to resort to a strategy of sharing resources just to save itself, its leaders terrified that the idea might catch on. Our enemies, they also tell us how to resist them. If fear, confusion, and despair are their weapons, then hope and clarity must be our medicines. If they depend on a parched landscape of isolation and division, then we offer the quenching waters of connection and unity. It's difficult for sure, but not complicated. Mutual aid and labor activism are necessary to win the things our people need. Drumming, song, and art are to remind them of who they are. We will get through this. I mean the collective we, because not all of us are going to make it. Our hearts ache for those of us already in mourning. There will be more losses to come. Still, our people will survive. But this time we will have 4 genies to help us in our work. 4 genies that are not about to be crammed back into those little lamps. In fact, it's not too early to start planning, to start making arrangements for a huge celebratory lamp smashing party.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Our last reader is Melissa Olson. And one of the things I think that's wonderful about this anthology is you get many different perspectives on the events that happened following the murder of George Floyd and how different individuals and communities reacted to this death. So Melissa Olson, Melissa?
Thanks, David. Thank you, and thanks to Carolyn, and thanks to One Book Minnesota for having us all. It's been a real honor and a joy to listen to Douglas and to Ed and to Ricardo. So thanks for inviting me. Just a little bit of context. David is right on. This revisits those days during the uprising and the unrest after Chauvin murdered George Floyd, and a little bit of information just to help tell you a little bit about how I came to write about what I wrote about. Is I worked for an organization located very close to the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct, and that organization is called Mackin Communications, and it's one of the older nonprofits founded by Native journalists in Minneapolis. And I was working there at that time. I was consulting there, working on digitizing Migizi's historic radio archive. On May 28th, I woke up a few minutes earlier than usual. The night before, my partner John and I had watched the 3rd Precinct set afire on national TV. And just the day before, I had suddenly realized how close Migizi's building stood in proximity to the center of the protest, just a block and a half away from the 3rd Precinct. I stood in the mirror nervously brushing my hair and trying to figure out what to do. I had to remind myself that I'm the sole support for my aging mother. So as much as I wanted to join the protests, I decided not to, uncertain of the probability of contracting COVID-19 and passing on to her. Instead, I picked up my phone and frantically scrolled through my social media feed to see if I could find an update on Migizi's building. A post by B'nai Means, Migizi's lead media specialist, confirmed that the building was okay. I called B'nai and she said that the protesters and others had stayed off the street where Migizi was located out of respect for a sidewalk clinic staffed by medical professionals treating injuries that protesters had sustained during the standoff with Minneapolis police the night before. Scrolling through my social media, I also learned that members of the American Indian movement had stood guard out in front of the building to protect it from fire and vandalism. Nevertheless, I told John that I needed to see the building for myself. We jumped into John's van and drove from our home in Northeast Minneapolis. As we got closer to the building, the chaos was palpable. The air was thick with smoke, and I remembered that it smelled like oil paint. We parked 5 blocks away and walked to Migizi as fast as we could. When we got there, we saw minor tagging on the building's south-facing wall, but thankfully it was otherwise untouched by fire, a fact we marveled at as we walked past the smashed-in window of Gandhi Mahal, the restaurant next door. People everywhere walked slowly in 2s and 3s to survey the damage, some snapping photos of the property damage. Fuck 12 in ragged handwriting was tagged everywhere, and black and brown youth zipped around on their bikes, observing people wandering in shock and disbelief. It felt like a kind of root shock because nothing in the neighborhood resembled the orderly commercial corridor it had been just the day before. Debris was strewn everywhere we looked, and what was left of burned out buildings was covered in soot. The streets were wet, not from water from fire truck hoses, but from spray from the broken windows where sprinkler systems had been set off. We stood for a few minutes at the corner directly across from the police station and watched a man standing on the other corner yelling into a bullhorn pointed at the charred 3rd Precinct. Am I a man? Am I a man? We walked back to the van and cut slowly through alleys and side streets to find a way through the crowd that was beginning to reassemble. Once inside the van, John leaned against the door, lowered his shoulders, and set his chin. Then he looked over at me and said, "The building is not going to survive the night. If you're going to get the tapes out, we need to do it now." Thankfully, it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, so we knew we had time. When we got home, I called Minneapolis and we made plans to move the entire archive. Next, I called KFAI and was given permission to store the boxes in an empty studio where they could remain through the night. John and I returned to Miggizzy an hour later with the boxes. Undeterred by detours and traffic barriers, we drove up the alley behind Miggizzy and parked at the back door. With the help of staff members and teens from the First Person Youth Production Program, we were able to quickly pack up our tapes, stack the boxes into the van. Then we took off and made our way the 20-some blocks to KFAI. One of the teens that came with us and helped haul the boxes up to the 3rd floor to the studio we were given use of for the night. The young man was unusually quiet. Later, I learned that his brother had been killed by police a year before. By the time we finished moving the boxes to KFAI, the adrenaline had started to wear off and we were all hungry. We bought a lunch at the sub shop up the block, then drove another block over to Augsburg University campus. We found a picnic table and sat down to eat. While we were eating, John looked up and pointed to a bald eagle that was passing overhead, having flown from the direction of the river. I have never considered myself especially spiritual, but seeing that bald eagle at that moment, the bird for whom Miggizzy named itself, left the three of us feeling assured that we had accomplished our work for that day. Just as John had predicted, Miggizzy's building caught fire that night as embers from fires on either side of the building blew onto the roof. Miggizzy's executive director, Kelly Drummer, and her husband, Sam, and their daughter stayed in that building as long as they could. They called 911, but fire trucks never came. Thank you so much. Thanks so much again for inviting me, David and Carolyn.
Thank you, Melissa. Talk about preserving history. Is actually what we were doing. Now we're going to open up to discussion and question and answer. And I think, Elaine, are you going to feed us the questions?
I absolutely will. And for all of you who are attending, please do start to put questions in the chat. And the first one that we have is for you, David and Carolyn, around the anthology itself. There's so much to consider when putting together an anthology, not the least of which is order, not the least of which is everything that you're trying to contain in this one book. What guided the two of you through that process?
David, you want to grab that one?
I'll let you go first.
Wow, it was quite a fascinating process. As you've heard from these wonderful writers, we had so many beautiful, important pieces of literature to choose from, and trying to figure out what order they should go into was quite an interesting task. The only thing that I was really adamant about was that I wanted Ed Bok Lee's piece to be the first up, because it feels, and it still does, it feels like an invitation into the book. And I just want to thank you all again, and Ed, especially right now, for giving us that beautiful piece to open the anthology with. And then we decided, I believe, that Alex Pate's piece would go next, because in the first, I think it's in the second or third paragraph of his piece, he says, "We are meant to rise." And that's where we were able to get the title from. Quite an amazing piece. And then David and our editor, Eric, they both put together what they thought might be a good order. And in the end, we worked together to figure out, what would be the end, the order and the ending, which David, I believe we decided that Louise Erdrich's piece would be a really good ending for the book, along with yeah, because of you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think we wanted Louise's essay to end partly because it's Louise Erdrich, right? But also because she was writing about history and Native history and the activism of her father, which felt very appropriate to end the book. I think the other thing about the order was a sort of Rubrik's cube. You know, we had several essays on the murder of George Floyd and the uprising, and we wanted to space them throughout the anthology. We had several essays on the pandemic. We wanted to space them out. We wanted to, you know, to have rather than people from one ethnicity or one race together, to spread them throughout the book, to spread, you know, different ages of people. So it was really trying to get an order which would accommodate and display the variety of voices and to weave them together throughout different themes and different subjects throughout the book. So it took a little while. It really was a little like trying to arrange a Rubik's Cube or a puzzle, trying to get all the pieces to sort of flow from subject to subject. Yeah.
David pointed out, we very intentionally, you know, sought out writing from people who were emerging all the way through people with international reputations, so that we would be able to show, you know, diversity in a lot of different ways, you know, in more than just the diversity of race and ethnic and ethnicity, but also in the types of writing that were, you know, that we accepted for the book.
Yes, and as one of the examples, what I love in the book is there's an essay by Kevin Yang where he talks about growing up, you know, and the way the educational system is educating him is to not identify as a Hmong. In fact, his teacher says to him, if you want to be good in school, you know, don't sit with the other Hmong kids, right? And so he's growing up going to hate being Hmong. And then the teacher, one of his English teachers, happens to give him, show the class a poem by a Hmong writer. And suddenly his head lights up. It's like, oh God, there are Hmong people writing. And then he gets into poetry, and then he decides to enter poetry reciting contests. And the poem that he recites is Bok Lee's poem about Latasha Harlins, who was a young Black girl who was killed by a Korean grocery store owner, which was actually one of the precursors to what happened when Rodney King was beaten in LA, because this Korean grocery store owner shot Latasha Harlins, but it was not, served a 6-month probation, and that was it. So that was part of the react. Anyway, so Ed's poem, Kevin Yang would read it at poetry reading contests. And then, you know, many years later, he's in an anthology with Ed Bok Lee. I just love that, you know. So this is the way that art is handed down and inspires generation after generation.
It's really wonderful. I mean, I think that it's all, I mean, all of the work that you so obviously did, I mean, certainly all the contributors, but the work that the two of you did shows so clearly, because it's such each piece is a journey, but the whole thing has this propulsive feel that you have this full arc, and it's just, it's really stunning in that way. So we have a question that is inspired by Ricardo's piece. His line about the power of art, forgive me, I think I'm adding a gerund here, Ricardo, but the power of art making the invisible visible and making the visible feel manageable, which is really hopeful. And it got us to thinking about how much hope is in this entire collection, woven in, of course, right, with pain and trauma and anger and reality that we're in. And I'm not sure that there's an actual question here, but I'm wondering if each of you would want to respond to how you feel hope intersects with your writing in this collection, or even more generally.
You want to start, Ricardo, since that question was inspired by your piece?
Yeah, sure. And I should, for anybody listening who's confused, that's one of the lines that I didn't read tonight in order to fit within the time constraints. But yeah, I mean, I see hope as a commitment, but as a commitment and basically as a life force. This is a question that often confuses me, because I don't see hope as something that you need to acquire. I think hopelessness is something that we need to shed. It's an inherent fact of life in any ecosystem that hope is what drives us forward. Any chipmunk or hawk or butterfly that ventures out for their day or night's work is being driven by hope to find a nesting place or a mate or something to eat, right? So really the question is, what is the nature of the damage that is so great that it interferes with this essential function of our nervous systems and our bodies, right? So I see my work, my writing, my art, all of that as undermining the assault of toxicity, cultural toxicity, as well as chemical forms of oppression that suppress that essential power that we have. Because when we can counter and neutralize those toxins, the brilliance, the imagination, and creativity and power and connectivity that is in the mycelium, ecosystem of human beings is able to produce not only uprisings, but the forms of organization and structure that can replace toxic and destructive technologies, and that can also move us forward in terms of how we reorganize ourselves in the relationship to nature that we deeply remember, even if we don't always remember that we remember it.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. I mean, so actually Kevin Yang and I got to do one of these talks together with Carolyn so half a year ago or so, and this issue came up of hope. And at the time, it was before, I think, like in early spring, at the time I said hope, something like hope is that's the past, right? We're in the present. For me, hope, I've evolved to think for myself, is sort of more useful personally to think about not hope, but skillfulness. It's a Buddhist term. And at the time, just very briefly, I'll say that at the time I said, 6 months ago or so, you don't hope to have a fruitful yield in your garden unless you've done the work, and unless you've done the weeding, and unless you've done the watering, right? So it's actually not about hope, it's about how much you put into it. And yes, you can hope that you have a good outcome and all your plants bear fruits and vegetables and everything is great, but often that doesn't happen, or not all of them do. But what can you do? You can only do your best. And now I'm thinking 6 months later about skillfulness, and how when I have personally felt a lack of hope, it's more of an inner quarrel with myself in terms of my level of skillfulness in life, dealing with a particular or a panoply of life circumstances that require a higher skill level than I feel I'm capable of, or that I've accrued or developed. And then I feel hopeless, which eventually just turns into frustration. It's sort of like, you can hope your lawn, if you own a house, you can hope your lawn gets mowed, you can hope, you can read every book on hope. You can read the history of hope. It ain't gonna get mowed unless you go out there and do it, right? And so for me, again, it's hopelessness is more an personal inner quarrel with my lack of skillfulness in how to deal with something. And the only answer is to develop those skills. I'm not saying it's easy, but the world keeps evolving, life keeps changing. New challenges arise every day, every week, every year, and they require new skills. And they also require old skills that you haven't used in a long time that are rusty, or that you've been told, you know. I finally got around to watching Squid Game. I just watched the last, you know, old skills that you thought were defunct or not, had no use, suddenly are extremely useful. And it's interesting, the last thing I'll say is having a now 6-year-old and seeing her develop skills and getting frustrated with certain skills and getting frustrated with certain very necessary skills that I know she's going to need later, and trying to help her navigate her way through that instead of giving up and just doing other things. So that's where I am today. Ask me in 6 months and I might have a different take on hope.
I'll pitch in a little bit. You know, about sort of the mowing the lawn and all of that. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, in the surrounding suburbs, across the state, when it comes to what has been experienced over the past several years in Minneapolis, specifically around all that's happened following Chauvin's murder of George Floyd. I think we have yet to really you know, continue the work to sort of make meaning out of what's happened. We have to do that. We have to get together and we have to make meaning, just like this. You know, being invited to write something allowed me to organize my thoughts, right? Allowed me to sort of be in community with people who I knew who were likewise sort of wrestling with these events, you know, things that were happening outside their front doors, quite literally. I live in Northeast Minneapolis. We had the National Guard posted on Buchanan and Broadway that entire, starting that Thursday. You know, I drove to the end of my street and I looked at somebody, a National Guards person armed with an automatic rifle. And, you know, so we've started telling stories about what's happened, what happened during those days, and we need to continue to do the work. And I think that work of making meaning from that which we know happened, we were there, we experienced it, just like many of you might have been there, or you experienced some piece of it. You know, I can remember going to a grocery store because ours was closed down, like out in White Bear Lake, and, you know, masked, just, you know, my partner is a big guy, he's a Native guy, and we were just so nervous going to this grocery store in White Bear Lake. I can only imagine, you know, I can barely imagine sometimes what was going through my own head. And I sometimes, you know, imagine, you know, how people perceived us, but there was so much fear, I guess is my point at that time, you know, about everything that was happening. I feel like everything that had happened that week was sort of like written across my forehead. And like maybe I wanted people to read that or something, but we need to communicate about what's happening in Minnesota. We need to talk to each other more. And we need to do it with real energy and, you know, if that's through a creative presence, is that this kind of active, artistic, creative presence, then I think we're gonna do more, and we're gonna go farther in those conversations. So that is really what gives me hope. And then when I need a little bit extra, I look at Carolyn and I look at David and I look at Ed and I look at Ricardo and I meet the great folks from, who are doing all this curatorial work. And that gives me hope. I truly appreciate being here.
I think for me, in certain ways, as I've gotten to be older, it is a little easier to feel a sense of hope because you remember when things were different. My grandfather came here in 1898. He was not allowed to become a citizen by law. He was not allowed to even own property. Immigration from Japan was stopped in 1924. My parents were imprisoned in a concentration camp. This past year, my daughter was elected as to the Minnesota House of Representatives from her district in South Minneapolis. I think about watching Reverend now Senator and Senator Warnock on the stage last night from Georgia. And he's there with his mother, who was born a sharecropper, who worked as a sharecropper. She had 12 children. Senator Warnock was the first member of her family to go to college. And he's a senator. And, this country is going backwards and forwards at the same time. It's very clear. But I look at the passage of time. 30 years ago, I lost almost all my white friends because I argued with them about yellow face casting. None of those people would get up in public and argue for yellow face casting today. The artists in this anthology come from so many different generations, and you see these voices coming up, these young people, and that's what gives me hope. Now it's not easy. I think of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have to be very realistic about how things are and our chances. But we have, and the other saying I always think is good will win as long as it's as organized as the mafia. And I think the other thing that you saw in Georgia was a great organization built like people like Stacey Abrams to bring out the vote. So we have to keep working, but you see progress. There is progress everywhere. And we just have to keep working.
An essay in the anthology about feeling hopeful when, after the last presidential election, because as we know, the administration prior to that was fomenting all kinds of ugly, horrible stuff against all kinds of people. And though it didn't seem like there was a reason to hope, I was feeling really hopeful. And then over the last couple of years with, things continuing to get just, see so many ugly things happening. My hope was, I was waffling all the time. Do I feel hopeful or don't I feel hopeful, and why? And, I love what everyone has said here tonight. And, I think with the midterm elections and last night with Raphael Warnock, I am feeling hopeful again. And we still have a lot of work to do. And we as artists and writers, we tend to lead the way, with hope and progress. And, as Melissa pointed out, we're doing, we are working together in some ways, having these discussions and having these conversations with, others in communities that are different than ours. It's very important that we, keep talking to each other, to keep, developing the hope, the sense of hope that we have, because it is going back and forth and backwards and forward and up and down. And yet there still seems to be, a sense that things are going to be okay. I don't know if that made sense, but that's how I'm feeling in this moment.
absolutely made sense. And I so love that thought about the action and hope. And I think, your book, the whole collection also is I think what an exhortation to us as the readers, like that we can't only depend on all of the artists to have and carry the hope and the story, that we have a responsibility as readers, and we'll have different events and hear from different writers, and people will write in and say, well, what can we do? Well, you're reading, which is good, but it isn't just wishing for something, right? We have to make our own action, whatever that is, whatever those skills are, right, that we need to do. So I love that about the collection too, is that that call, that the call to action is a call to hope. But that means working and doing something. I'm kind of going off there, but I'm just really inspired by everything that everyone has said. And there's a comment in the chat that someone who in the audience feels hopeful because we have events like this with such wonderful and diverse people and topics and books. And so I just echo that wholeheartedly. I think that, we're kind of, getting sort of toward the end of the evening, but I wanted to just open up some space. Is there, anything else that you'd like to share about your experience in writing your pieces, or in the collection, or some of the events that you've done as a part of it, or what you're sort of looking to do next? It's kind of an open, another kind of open call.
Jump in. I think most recently I've been trying to write more about sort of or return to write about sort of my family's relationship with this sort of complex web of relationships that is my family. In Minnesota, it's such a special and important place in that story. It is, it is a relation. But, I think for me, because like so many Native families, right, my family experienced, generational displacement, that I've, I'm really inspired by, writers like Louise Erdrich. I'm especially inspired, and I go back time and time again to Gerald Visner, who not uncoincidentally is living back in Minneapolis, as I understand it, and really talk about something he called survivance, which is, this idea that we are not, that when we respond creatively, it's an active creative presence. It's not, it doesn't sort of give way to the tragedy that we experience, and that it goes beyond just something that we remember historically to create and really be with people in real time and politic in meaningful ways. But my piece in that has been to just talk a little bit about something that I like, that I've sort of teased from Visner, which I just call nurturance. These stories that actually take place in some hard places, like boarding schools, like the places where my parents and grandparents found themselves as small children, but through all of that found ways to be self-nurturing, rediscovered ways to not only survive, but to show themselves a little bit of self-love. And I think for people my generation, we're so self-reliant because we have these parents who are so terrifically, they're such amazing survivors, right? That we pride ourselves on our self-reliance. But for me, it's a shift, not because I'm not self-reliant, but because sometimes self-reliance can, one can be appropriately sort of callous, and lose a little bit of that spark. So I've been writing about sort of these small nurturances that for me sort of move me from maybe self-reliance a little closer to that self-nurturing, that self-love. it's not necessarily exuberant. It's not always, plums, peaches, and roses or anything like that. But it's those small things, just, small openings, noticing things like that. And I think all that's happened has really, the pandemic, maybe because we spent so much time at home, all of us, and the small things became such important, poignant things, that's what I find myself writing about.
Yeah, I find myself just thinking always about how, my people have been through so much in 400 and some years, and we're still here. And so what I've been working in fiction lately, which is sort of new to me, but I kind of want to focus on how trauma and resilience are in the DNA of Black women and girls. And, I think about my daughters and my granddaughters and my mother and my grandmother and all the things that we have dealt with for, so many years. So I'm kind of focusing on that in my writing right now, and I'm kind of having fun with it. And yet it's really kind of fascinating to take a hard look at this through the lenses of the three characters that I'm working with. That's what I'm doing.
Ed, Ricardo?
Yeah, I'm just writing poems towards the fourth book, and also doing some fiction. I was going to say something earlier to piggyback off of something Melissa said. It'll come back to me, but yeah, that's it. Ricardo.
Survivance. That's a beautiful term. I'm going to use that. Thanks, Melissa. And Gerald Visner.
Yeah, and I'll hold the space until you remember what you're going to say. Yeah, I'm trying to think.
You got to
of
speak up a
how-
little more, Ricardo.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I've been sort of puzzling over that question. Writing has, for many years, been kind of a subsidiary part of my activism. I think of my art as being medicinal in some of the ways that I described, and the same with writing. Writing is like a container to carry medicines. And as I learn more about what those medicines are, I think of Ella Baker saying that in order to know where we're going, we not only have to know where we've been, but we have to understand where we've been, right? And then writing, art, all those are containers for that. But in recent years, I've been beginning much more boldly, I would say, to pay attention to the container. How is this basket woven? How do I find a voice in writing that is a worthy container for the medicines that I want to carry, because otherwise it won't be delivered, right? And I appreciate people like David and Carolyn and a number of others in the writing community who keep insisting on treating me like a writer and bringing me into spaces. And what changes about that is that it means that my writing is vocalized in relationship to rooms full of people or screens full of people, and to have that chemistry back and forth, which I've experienced with my art. I've mentored so many young artists unsure about their work, and I say, just get out there, put something into the community, let the back and forth begin, because that's how you'll learn how good you are. And you'll begin to be understanding what this mirror that you're holding to the community means, and what mirror they're going to hold back to you. And I feel like I'm in that moment, and where that's taking me is mostly in a book that I'm writing, which I will say no more about at the moment. I prefer to work like mycelium, mostly in the darkness. And really, that's what I got. This is, I'm very much looking forward to inviting in sort of the the lushness, the complexity, and the different textures. You can tell that I'm a visual artist talking into the writing that I'm working on.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Ricardo is a brilliant visual artist who has welded his activism with his art in terrific ways. And he has a shop that all of you should visit so that you can get some of his visual art.
When we let you, because we're still honoring COVID protocols
Right,
and other infectious diseases, but we're active. You can find us and
Yeah.
figure out how to interact with us.
One other word I want to say about hope is that for all of us, we have ancestors who in many ways went through much worse than we have. And we are their gift to the future. And so I feel like we have to hope because we are their hope, right? Just like I just had a grandson, he's my hope. He's going to see 2,300, you know, it's we pass things on, and you work, you teach, you do writing, and you never know where these gifts then end up blossoming. And my life, you know, because I normally don't say this in public, I'm 70. And I could never have imagined how rich a community I could be. I grew up in a mainly white suburb of Chicago. There were like 10 Asian Americans in a school of 3,200, and that was it. And I was related to half of them. So to become part of this brilliant artistic community and have friends from all these different traditions and communities is just such a gift. And I look at so many of my friends who, you know, in many ways, when they were younger, you could never have guessed what they became, right? Nobody would ever guess what they became, you know, growing up in a barrio in Santo Domingo, you know, in North Philly, on the south side of Chicago, you know, Ed coming from, from Korea, right? This is what is so brilliant, you know, and the brilliant colors of the American tapestry is what gives me hope, right? This is a beautiful anthology, right? It's filled with pain, it's filled with anger, righteous anger, but it's also filled with beauty. And that gives me hope. I have a book coming out, The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself, Racial Myths in Our American Narratives. And it starts with an essay on Philando Castile. And I then go back in history and look at the roots of his murder and what happened on Larpenteur Road. And unfortunately, it ends with an essay on George Floyd and his murder, sort of his bookends. And in between, I talk about the ways that we have traditionally told our history, which has been solely from, not only solely from the viewpoint of white America, but filled with distortions and lies about what has happened in our past. And I contrast that with the narratives and perspectives of African Americans, both in history and in fictional narratives, and show what these white narratives leave out about our history, about who we have been, and how we need to reckon with this history, in part because we can't understand the present unless we understand the past, out of which the present came from, the past which caused this presence. And if we underestimate the racism and white supremacy of the past, we will not be able to see the racism and white supremacy in the present. And so we have to look at figures like Jefferson, like Lincoln, and we have to recognize their genius. But you also have to recognize Jefferson had 600 slaves. He had sex with a 16-year-old girl who was his slave. And we have to hold those two things in our head at the same time. And we can't look away from it, because if we look away from it, we look away from things in the present. So, yeah, so that, and I'll be giving readings and things from the book in the next year.
Yeah, very briefly, I remembered what I wanted to say earlier, if I may. So I can't remember at what point in talk something Melissa said, but it reminded me that the greater the hopelessness, the stronger the impulse and need in me or in one. It is the greater the hopelessness, the stronger the impulse and need to shed your former mindsets and come closer to who you really are. You know, that person on your deathbed in your last moment that you're either gonna feel you became, or you will understand in that moment that you never got there. I used to work in an elderly center, and I saw a lot of people in that stage. And so in some sense, you know, hopelessness is a gift. It's a call. It's a request. Because two people over the same external political situation, one can be fired up with hope and one can be completely dejected and lose all hope, right? That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I think it's again, there's, you know, what we do with that hopelessness and how we enact our hope. And I just have been so inspired by all of your work, by the anthology as a whole, and really, really appreciate your time and energies and thoughts this evening, and all of our attendees as well. As we have still available, We Are Meant to Rise is available for free download through this Sunday, December 11th. So if you have not yet read it or want to reread it or revisit any of these amazing pieces, that link is in the chat. And you can still visit thefriends.org/onebook for additional resources. So people from all over the state have been reading the anthology, and it is a gift to our whole state. So I'd also like to thank our partners for One Book, One Minnesota, the Council of Regional Public Library Systems Administrators, Mackin VIA, Minitex, the Minnesota Department of Education, and University of Minnesota Press, the publisher of We Are Meant to Rise. This program is made possible in part by the voters of Minnesota, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, as well as through a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. So we do want to hear what the program has meant to you as readers and participants in the event. So be on the lookout for a brief questionnaire. We'll send a link to we'll also be sending a link out to the recording of today's event. So I know that and people are writing in the chat about how much this has meant to them, and I'm leaving the program with a greater appreciation for the amazing writers we do have in our state, in the now, and especially the contributors to this book, who I'm going to quote from you, David, as you put it, have been such valued witnesses to our present and to all of us this evening. So thank you all again so much for being a part of One Book, One Minnesota. And good night.
Thank you.
And thank you again for having us.
Bye-bye. Thanks.